From the South Carolina School Boards Association, I'm Scott Price, SCSBA Executive Director, and welcome to the Voice of School Boards. It's in the complex world of public education that school board members find themselves squarely at the forefront. From the loftiness of policy development and having a vision for schools to the rudiments of budget developing and building classrooms, school board members are tasked with addressing the challenges and inequities in education. Oftentimes, in the process of doing so, school board members' voices and that of other local leaders become a whisper. The goal of this podcast is to educate, amplify, and engage in a civil discourse on where we've been in education, where we are now, and where we hope to go in the future. Along the way, we'll meet some very interesting people and also have a little fun. Joining us on this episode of the Voice of School Boards podcast is Dr. David Mathis. Dr. Mathis is the chair of the South Carolina Board of Education. And Dr. Mathis, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
You tell us a little bit about your background, and we'll dive a little deeper into
Okay.
this later on. But you've been in education for a number of years. You've been in the schools, you've taught, you've been in school administration, district level administration, superintendent, worked at the state level of the department, and then you're on the State Board of Education. Tell us how you got here.
So I started as a middle school teacher, social studies teacher, and in Edgefield County, loved every minute of teaching middle school. That was a happy place, teaching middle school kids. Several years into that, I went into school level administration and was an assistant principal, then moved into the principalship. My first school was a K-8 school as a principal, and that was interesting, but it was really good. There was a lot of things we could cohesively do, K-8. It was a great situation.
And that was in Edgefield?
That was in Edgefield, in Meriwether. And then Edgefield went through a referendum and we built new schools, and I became the elementary principal at Meriwether Elementary and moved to the district office in, I think, 1999 to be the assistant superintendent for instruction in Edgefield. Stayed there, I think, about 6 years doing that role, and then transferred over to Aiken County and was the associate superintendent for administration, which was a catch-all for a lot of jobs. It was HR, it was transportation, it was assessment, just a variety of things. But I will tell you, that probably was one of the best training grounds to be a superintendent, because you had a variety of things to do, and especially in HR, because a lot of decisions you have to make in HR that are pretty quick and have a big impact. So that was...
But you didn't take an HR background to that.
Yeah, no, I just came up the regular route. And so that was very, very interesting. You have to learn quick in that role. And then I went to Saluda and had a great experience there. One of the best boards in the state of South Carolina. Was there for 9 years as superintendent, rural county. And our greatest resource there was our teachers. Clearly, It was our greatest resource. Didn't have a lot of money, but we have a lot of dedicated people there that cared about the kids. And then after 9 years, I went to the State Department of Ed and actually went in as Director of Early Learning and Literacy. And a couple of months into the role, Molly Spearman, who was a state superintendent, called me and she said, "David, your boss, Julie Fowler, is leaving to go to a school district. Would you consider being the deputy?" So I did that. And I will tell you, that was a great, great experience, but it was during COVID as well. COVID came around. And so nobody at any level was prepared for that. And so there was a lot of learning that we had to do. It was like flying an airplane. You got to get it off the ground. And then you've got to land it again. And it was just a lot of people coming together to work.
And David, I just want to interject here too, because I remember that vividly. Obviously when COVID hit, and so many people turned to the department for guidance because nobody knew what to do.
Yeah.
I remember taking a couple of carloads of masks over to
Yeah.
mom and where y'all had this
Yeah.
distribution center for
Yeah.
PPE and masks, and thank God that you all were in that position because
Right.
again, no one knew what to do, and it was very helpful to get some direction, no matter which direction it was.
Right. And Scott, I remember vividly on Monday in March, it was at a staff meeting. Molly asked me to get out a memo to district superintendents to ask if they had a 10 to 15-day plan if we were required if we had to shut down because of COVID. And that got that out to that memo went out on Friday the 13th. The next
The
Sunday
next
is when Governor McMaster closed all the schools. And so it was getting plans together. It was just moving. And we really thought that we would be back in school in 10 to 15 days. That, of course, as we realize now, didn't happen. And we realized my focus at that time was there's a group of seniors that we've got to make sure they graduate on time and they go to what's next. And so we worked with all the agencies, higher ed, vocational, the career and technology schools to make sure that we're all singing out the same songbook. But there's stories you remember, we all remember during that time. But I do remember I got a phone call from a student, and he was a senior in high school, and we had put some deadlines on when their work needed to be in, and so that we could make sure that we were meeting all the graduation requirements. And it was one of those days he found my number. I think probably a guidance counselor somewhere gave him a memo that I had written, and so he called me and he said, "Is there anything you can help me with?" He said, "Both of my parents have lost their jobs during COVID, and I can cut grass and I can do lawn care work, and I am out trying to make sure that we have something coming in so that we can survive." And at that point it was, "Don't worry. We will figure this out. We will help you. We will help you get through it." And that's what a lot of it was because we'd never experienced anything like it. And so you really had to take on, you couldn't be pharisaical with it. You had to, some of those rules just weren't always black and white. You had to work in that gray area to help those students get through. So it was, yeah. So COVID was a real learning experience. So, and then I retired in January 23, and I had put a pin in the sand. I knew that that was when I wanted to retire, and so I did. My wife sat me down and she said, "Okay, if you're going to retire," she said, your phone rings off the hook 24/7. You answer emails all day long, and when you retire, that's going to suddenly stop." She said, "You need to find something to do." And I took that two ways.
Wow.
That was good for me, but it was probably good for her too, that I wouldn't always bothering her. And then a year or so later, our legislative delegation asked if I was interested in being on the state board. So here I am.
Well, tell us, I guess for our audience, not everybody knows perhaps about what the state board is, what the state board does. Now you represent the Second Circuit.
I do.
How many 16 members on the state board?
Yes, yes. And one member, of course, is appointed by the governor. And I think a lot of people, in my experience, we get a lot of emails, we get a lot of, calls, and I think a lot of times the general public doesn't really understand our role and and how we got there. And as you said, we each represent a different legislative circuit, and so our legislative delegation appoints you to the state board. And so it's we don't hire or fire the state superintendent. The state superintendent is elected by the general population. And actually, the state superintendent, Ellen Weaver, is considered the secretary for the state board.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah,
I'll
yeah,
have
and
to
that's the way it's
look at
written
that
in
sometime.
in policy that she is the secretary of the state board. But our role really centers around the policies, the regulations, all the provisions that deal with state laws that come to us, approving minimum standards or the standards for our content standards. We approve of the examinations, the certificates, whatever it takes for a teacher to be, or an administrator to be certified in the state. So we do that. We provide, or we support the policies around the resources that go out to our schools and the budgets around those. So for example, the textbooks and instructional materials that are in our schools today are approved by the state board. Thankfully, our State Department of Education does a great job to help provide us with all the information that we need. But all of your instructional materials really do come through the state board. Now, districts can provide their own set of, additional things that they want to do, but the things that the legislature funds, the state board approves those. And so any policies that
Policy development and regulation.
regulations that have to be written about our schools or our school districts do come through us. And so a lot of those have to do with licensure for the positions, all of our employee positions. We approve higher ed programs, teacher prep programs. A lot of people don't understand our role with that, but we do hear those, and they present those to us, and we approve those. Unfortunately, there are times that we have to act on a teacher certificate that are an employee, a certified employee that may have made some bad choices, and we have to consider the next level of what happens with their certificate. We approve all of the standards, as I said, the assessments, the state assessments, any of the benchmark assessments. The State Department brings those to us to approve. And here recently, you may know there are things that come to us through the legislature. One was recently the cell phone policy for students. So we developed policy around that. And the other was the legislature asked us to develop and monitor the policy around appropriate instructional materials. And so
Let me ask you about this, because not that in particular, because in my experience and perhaps in yours, I've seen sort of the role of the state board morph over time. And you just touched on two things where we're seeing more and more where the legislature, if they pass something, they will put in their state board of education will develop model policies, blah, blah, blah. And that's historically and traditionally not been a role for the state board in developing model policies. I mean, districts, we do that,
right.
association traditionally, and we do it per statute or case law or something. Used to be that the legislature would say districts shall have policies that reflect what's in this statute. And now more and more you're seeing that being shifted over to the state board. I don't know how I feel about that. I'm gonna just ask you how you feel about that.
Well, I
Am I-
think there are certain issues that are priorities that come up that I think that the legislature is looking for consistency across the state. And perhaps when the state board does that, and we have to carefully consider how, you can write a policy, but how's it going to be implemented? And I know with the cell phone policy, implementing, having a policy is one thing, but being a district being able to implement it effectively is different. So I think the consistency is one thing, but I think there's also a little bit more trust in the state board and the people that are there, that they're not going to rubber stamp something that comes to them, and they're going to consider the impact, because we do have a cross section of people on the board. There are educators, there are business people, but when you come together, you have a lot of different perspectives that come, and so what emerges is a well thought out policy. And so I think that some of these issues that maybe the legislature, as I said before, consistency across the state, that may be why it comes to the state board.
And I think that's a fair way of looking at it too. So I appreciate your perspective on that. There are some other areas too where the state board, I think, has picked up more responsibility, and then you all now are involved in potential takeovers and even dissolutions, and we saw that with the Jasper board, and hopefully that's not something that state board will ever have to deal with again.
Yeah, that is, and I will tell you, that is something that you don't take lightly because I think what I do appreciate about what the State Department does before it gets to us, I see it that if it comes to a takeover of any kind, whether it's finances, the financial resources, or whether it is the takeover of the district, I think the State Department, when it comes to the state board, if we have to do that and vote on that takeover, we've done everything we can do. Everything has been done to that point to help. And in some cases, I know people look at that very punitively, but in some cases, it's also this is a way to help you, out of
Help that
this.
help that community.
Right,
Uh,
right. And it's not. And so I think that, especially in the situation, I think, with Marlboro and taking over the finances that we did, there's a lot of potential there. And so being able to go in and provide resources, and because as you well know, education funding in South Carolina is not an easy thing. It can get complicated. And
oh
so
yeah.
providing the resources and the help so that that community has everything that they deserve. So yes, we've taken on that role, but I would say if it comes down to that, it's help, but we're doing everything we can do to help you, that community.
Well, and again, I know that was a kind of a out of left field
Yeah,
question, so
no,
I appreciate your thoughts
yeah,
on that and
no worries.
responses. Tell me a little bit about what you see in your experience, but now where you are on the state board, chair of the state board. What do you see as the most pressing issues, maybe top two or three issues that you see for public education in South Carolina?
Probably could focus on two. I would say two things come to mind. First is teacher recruitment and retention. I'm a firm believer we should put our priorities and our focus, the people that stand in front of our students and spend most of their who our students spend most of the time with. And that's our teachers and the building level, the school level administrators that support them. If you've been around me long, you've probably heard me say an effective teacher who is supported by an effective administrator is magic. We can overcome all kind of barriers. We can overcome poverty. We can overcome English language learners. There's so many things that we can overcome with effective teachers and supportive building level administrators. So I see that as a huge issue that we should keep in front of us, and retaining quality teachers, hiring effective teachers, especially in our rural districts, in our poverty district, providing the resources that they need. And I don't know, you may have seen the work of and the data that SC Teacher provides,
Mhm.
Ann Bird and Sandy Bassard and some of those, the data that they have is incredible, but it's very informative of what our needs are and where our needs are and why teachers leave the profession and where they go when they leave the profession. But teacher recruitment and retention, if we get that right, and if we could really focus on that, then that's going to help with student achievement. That's going to help with learning gaps. That's going to college and career readiness. So many of the other things that it will affect if we get that right. So I see that it's a challenge, but it's something that we really focus on, especially in our rural and in poverty areas. So statewide, I would see focus and
You feel like we're on the right track with that? I mean, the legislature, to their credit, and the governor and Superintendent Weaver have really been in the bully pulpit about
yes.
teacher pay.
Yes,
And
and I think that will help. And then, as I mentioned, the SE teacher, if I were out there in the schools today or in the districts today, I would really look at that data that they have. But because it tells me why teachers leave the profession, where they go when they leave me. Did they go to another district? Did they move out of state? Did they leave the profession? And so there's a lot of trends there that could help, and they can do that with every district. And so I would look at that to see what are the trends in my district. It's a great resource, but high turnover really impacts the intentionality of teaching and the continuity of that. It impacts school culture. So yes, to your credit, the legislature, I think, has done a remarkable job in increasing the teacher pay. But I will also say, don't see it you don't also see this every day or hear about it, but teachers in South Carolina are fortunate when it comes to our benefits and our insurance and what's
Yeah.
provided for us. Early in my career, I didn't really understand or appreciate it as much. On this end of life where I'm using more of the needing to utilize more of my insurance benefits, it really, in my opinion, that adds to the benefits. We may not see it in our salary, but the benefits you have in South Carolina when it comes to insurance, I think is a real plus. The other thing that I think, and I have to commend our legislature on, is the funding they have provided the department for high quality instructional materials. And so that and they're crafting that in such a way that teachers don't have to go out and look for things. They're providing them the resources they need to plan those lessons. So teacher recruitment and retention, at the end of the day, I'm going to tell you that quality teachers and who are supported by building level administrators has the greatest impact on, in my opinion, on student learning. The other is the funding equity. And there's a lot of disparities and differences across our districts. And I think we've got to, it's better, I think, but I don't know that we have all the answers for that. But they're ensuring recurring equitable resources, I think, for our districts is a huge need and something that we should continuously look at in our state. And now is a great time because a lot of districts are coming out of the money that was given to them with COVID. And so the resources, things that you had then are different now, and you don't have the funding that you had. And so how do you help prioritize those? And so I think some of that is with like the work that you do at the School Boards Association, helping our school boards understand finance and the resources that are available. But that to me is something that we just probably haven't quite figured out yet. And there's more opportunities, I think, to restructure how we fund our schools.
Well, and we've been working on it for what, 50 years?
Yeah. Yeah, totally,
Possible to have
totally.
the game class going to a national championship in football. It ain't gonna happen in my lifetime, man.
Right.
So what about time for one more question? And then I'm going to, this is not one that was sent to you ahead of time, but I think with your experience, your background, your knowledge, the places you've been, the people you've met, if you were speaking to a room full of school board members, either, and it's a mix of veteran school board members, brand new school board members, and people who want to be on a school board, what would your advice be? What would you tell them?
Well, Scott, I've always, especially when I became a superintendent, I realized I think the most difficult elected position is a school board member. They're the closest to the people. They live with them every day. And so that is a role that I think is very difficult. But I would tell them to listen to their community, know the needs of the community. And in some places, there are different needs throughout the community. You've got to know your people. You've got to know what they need, communicate with them, because that builds trust and that builds buy-in. You're not always going to be happy with decisions, but that open communication with your constituents, with your community, I think really, as I said, builds that trust and buy-in that you have the best interest, for our students. The other is I would tell school board members, you've hired the superintendent, let him or her do their job. Stay in communication with them, but let them do their job. And when I was in Saluda, as I said, I had, I think, the best board in the state, but it was a great marriage. It was a great relationship. When I was hired, a school board member there told me, you will never be caught by surprise. You're not going to get to a board meeting and be caught by surprise. And so they said, we want you to come with the answers and come with the solutions, and we can determine then what hills we need to die on. But you're not going to get here and in a board meeting and be caught by surprise. And when I was told that, I knew that was a two-way street. I never needed to let them be caught by surprise. And so that communication, that weekly communication back and forth with that board was extremely important. And I made sure with my board chair, I had a weekly conversation, and that makes sure that we're all on the same page. We have a lot of transparency. So supporting that your superintendent, but also being, I can't emphasize enough, communication is oftentimes a point of failure in our districts. So communicate, be transparent with your constituents, and listen to them. It's a two-way street. Listen to them. May not be able to solve their problems or give them what they want, but at the end of the day, if they feel like you've at least listened and know them, they will support whatever efforts you're working on in that district.
David, you mentioned one thing just as a follow-up. Kudos that you all did have that good of a working relationship when you were superintendent with your boards. I imagine many on that board are still there, but things have changed to where school boards, there's so much more that's riding on decisions that they make. We tell school boards, historically, let the superintendent do his or her job, but more and more school boards and school board members have to be asking questions.
Yeah.
Because, getting that audit data and getting the audit in on time, report card data, all of it can have significant consequences leading up to potential dissolution. So it's fair I think, to say that and you as a superintendent, you probably welcomed questions from your school board.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's where that good communication comes in, the more we work together, they knew me, they knew how I thought, but I knew what they thought. I knew what they would need. And so, but I do think that, yes, school board members should ask questions, because you don't understand that oftentimes you're in that role as a school board member, but you don't often see the day-to-day operations of the school and all the things that go with that. And so, again, back to that communication, ask those questions, get clarity. And when that happens, what you see out into your school districts is transparency. That you're very transparent with the questions you're asking and the information that you need. And at the end of the day, it's to help the kids, the students in that district, be able to have all the opportunities that they need. But yeah, I think it's not a good thing to sit there and have questions and not ask about those. So, just make sure that you're clear on the direction of that district and what that superintendent, where they're headed. And good superintendents don't mind those questions.
Awesome. Well, I think we're about ready to wind up. Is there anything that you would like to touch on?
After 42 years, I retired. I love it. I loved every minute of it. Bill Hickson, who is a state legislator, he was one of those that appointed me to the state board. He and I grew up together. And he told me all along, you're going to be a teacher. He said, because in the neighborhood, you're always teaching us something. So, but I love school. I loved every minute of it. I loved my teachers. And I always want the kids in school today to have that same experience, that same great experience that I had. And so that's sort of why I do what I do.
Well, we thank you for your service. I know that there's many students in South Carolina who are better off because of the work that you've done over the years. I've always appreciated the relationship that we have, with you and your superintendent. I think you and your superintendent, I had just first started at the association, so I probably asked you many questions and you're patient with, and I appreciate that. Thank you for your time on Voice of School Boards, and good luck to you with the state board. And as always, I'm as chairman. If there's anything we can help out with, please let us know.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it.
Take care. And that's it for this episode of the Voice for School Boards. Thank you for sharing your time with us, and we'll see you soon.